Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast and get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today, we welcome Jon Appino. He's the founder of Contract Diagnostics. The Contract Diagnostics team offers comprehensive consulting services tailored to physicians and their families, addressing employment contracts and compensation structures. We're talking about the Kevin MD article, Why Your Physician Career Needs More Than a Contract Lawyer for Maximum Compensation. Jon, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, sir. It's been a pleasure reading a lot of your work over the years, and I appreciate all that you do.
So we'll get into your article in a little bit. But first off, just briefly share your story and journey.
My story. So I've been in healthcare, various roles for 20 years, 25 years. And based on what we felt a market need, from what you had recently said about the article that we just wrote, we created Contract Diagnostics 12 years ago. And so I've always loved being helpful to physicians in many different ways. And now we get to talk about compensation structures and contracts all day, every day. And it's been a pleasure to serve tens of thousands of physicians.
So you've been involved in this business for more than a decade now. What would you say are some of the biggest surprises when it comes to physician contract negotiation that you've discovered over the past years or so?
I think one of the big ones is that I think a lot of physicians feel that if a contract is non-negotiable, and I think it depends on who you ask on if that's true or not, but if they are told it's non-negotiable, that they should not have it reviewed by an expert. So just because it's non-negotiable or the employer won't change it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be reviewed by somebody who does a lot of physician contracts. It's one thing to be able to negotiate it. It's one thing to understand it and have lots of questions to ask as far as clarifications, things that are maybe left out or what would happen in certain situations. That's one of the things that I've been surprised on is these very important documents that physicians work very hard to obtain that contain potentially decades and millions of dollars worth of earnings, and they don't have it reviewed because they don't think it's important, they don't have time, or they don't think it's negotiable, so they don't have it reviewed. So that's one of the big surprises that I've had over the past decade.
So I've talked to several contract attorneys and physician contract review firms on this podcast, and they've written on Kevin MD. So in my world, it's a no-brainer that every physician should get their contract reviewed by an expert. But if you take a step back from this world, in general, from what you see, do you have a general percentage of how many physicians just kind of go it alone and not have their contract reviewed by experts?
I'd be guessing. My guess would be 50%.
And
so I think it's high. And I'm not quite sure exactly the why, whether they can do it themselves or whether they think it's not necessary or it's not negotiable. But I think it's a fairly high percent.
All right. So your Kevin MD article that we're going to talk about today is sometimes we need more than a contract lawyer for maximum compensation. So how did this particular article come together?
Again, based on our frame here, we do think that it needs more. Employers, again, whether it's negotiable or not, typically don't like to just have a red line version of the contract sent back. So oftentimes you'll have it professionally reviewed if you're one of the people that choose to do that, and maybe by an attorney, and the attorney might redline the contract, send it back to the employer for you, or maybe even they just send it to you. You never even talk to the attorney, and then you just forward the redline version over. An employer doesn't want this. Number one, they may not be willing to change anything. Number two, your intent as far as why you want something changed may not be transferred in the right way just by forwarding a redline copy over. So, and on top of that, it doesn't tell the story. So just by you receiving a redline copy of the contract or hopping on the phone with an attorney and being told something is good or something's bad or something is legal or not, it doesn't put into perspective the frame that physician might have or the story that they may have, the reason they want the job. It may not put into perspective the perspective of the employer, what they're looking for. And so we feel that much more is needed than just a red line copy or having an attorney, go through the contract from their perspective. We think it's much more holistic. And that's why not just having somebody review the contract when you go in and sign the position, but being able to have somebody explain it to you and give you good questions and give you good frame on how your story can be impacted by your negotiations with the employer. We also feel that, again, just having it reviewed today is one thing, but not just leaving it for a decade or for 5 years or for 7 years. but continuing to revisit the contract. Maybe the contract is just fine and nothing needs to change in the contract 3 years or 4 years or 5 years plus down the road. But if they're not updating your compensation package, or even if they are updating your compensation, those things should also be revisited. So just because you've done it one time with or without a contract lawyer doesn't mean that you should just kind of shelf the employment agreement, shelf the structure, shelf the decision to talk about it until 5 or 7 or 10 years down the road. We believe a checkup is a very good thing, and those things should happen every so many years. No different than me running in and having my cholesterol checked or an exam done on a routine basis to make sure that my physical health is in good order. Physicians put so much time into their craft and being able to train themselves with how much their market value is worth. They need to be able to keep up with what is that market value and not just have a number, but then to have a story to tell the employer on maybe why they should have a raise or why they should look at increasing their compensation or a bonus plan or fill in the blank.
So, give me an example of how this holistic approach looks like in action. So, in my world of primary care, and let's say I got a contract from an employer and I've heard good things about you and your firm, and I present that contract and say, John, I've been told to have this contract reviewed by many, many podcasts. So walk us through the next steps after you get that initial contact.
So first off, obviously understanding what it says is vital for every physician, but also having us understand your story and your frame. So we ask you guys a lot of questions. Do you want to be there for a long time or just a short term? Have they hired anybody in the past 6 months or in the past 5 years? Maybe you'll be the first physician into the practice. What are your goals? What are their goals? We'll ask a lot of questions to obtain the perspective. Maybe the job has been open for 2 years, 2.5 years. Maybe they've replaced a position every year for the last 3 years, and there's a problem with the position, and maybe you have more negotiating power because of those things, or maybe you don't even want the position based, on a couple of things that we uncover. Or maybe the employer's hired 5 people in the last 5 years, and everyone's been paid the same. Or maybe the employer tells you that they look at compensation median from MGMA. So what is that number? So I think one of the things that we do is just make sure we understand the physician's frame, their intent with the position, and what they're looking to get out of it, and then present that back to the physician with whatever's in their best interest, which obviously can be very different from, a primary care physician like yourself to working to support a spouse who's going through a fellowship for 2 years, and then they're going to relocate to somebody who wants to stay in the community long term. And the way that we might present a contract back to them, or the advice that we may give them as far as how they should negotiate, what they should negotiate, how they should ask, those might be two very different things in those situations.
A lot of times physicians receive a contract offer and they say that this is what we give out to every physician. This is our standard contract, non-negotiable.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that physicians encounter that scenario a lot. So from your experience, what are some common areas that are typically negotiable in these quote unquote standard contracts?
It may be none. It just depends. There might be certain languages that they're willing to change. They may say it's non-negotiable, but there might be 2 or 3 sections that they're willing to change. Maybe it's taking a non-compete from any location to the primary location. Or maybe it's a little fluidity in the signing bonus, but not in the base salary. Or maybe the RVU rate is static for everybody, but they're willing to adjust, a dollar amount for relocation. Again, if you're a attending physician, you maybe have more things. Your relocation would be higher than a new grad starting a new position. So those are some of the things I think that might be a little bit flexible depending on an employer and a quote standardized contract. But again, sometimes it comes down to it's non-negotiable and they really mean it. This is what we pay every single hospitalist. This is what we pay every surgeon. It's not going to change for you. It doesn't mean that the physician shouldn't ask a lot of questions. So even if it was my position and I was interviewing for it and I was presented a contract and told this is completely non-negotiable, of course I'd have it reviewed. And even if it's non-negotiable, I would do a lot of due diligence with that position to make sure it's the best fit for myself, my career, my family. So it might be non-negotiable, but doesn't mean that you shouldn't ask a lot of questions, of course.
So in the article, it implies that a physician may need more than an attorney to review the contract. Tell me the other members of a negotiating team a physician may need to optimize their negotiations.
Yeah, we have great attorneys here, but we also feel like just having it looked at the first time and then shelving it is not applicable. So making sure that people understand compensation. I remember one of the reasons that we started this company 12 years ago was I had a friend who was an oncologist, and he signed a contract, and I said, tell me about the process. And he said, I called a lawyer and they looked at it. I talked to him for 12 minutes on the phone, and he said everything looked just fine. And I said, did he teach you anything? He said, no. I said, did he tell you about the compensation? He said, I asked him if the RVU rate was good, and he said, I don't know anything about RVUs. I'm a lawyer. And so I think having experts in compensation, not just I can look at the MGMA data and tell you it's $62 or $52, but understanding trends, keeping up on trends. I think it's vital to have people like that on your team, but also important when you talk about your team, not just giving you the number. It's one thing if I know that my cholesterol is 200 and my A1C is 6. It's another thing if I have a plan from a physician on what should I do with that. And it's a whole other thing for my physician to understand my history. So do I have diabetes, and do I smoke, and do I have a family history? Because all those things play into, is my cholesterol of 200 and my A1C of 6 good or bad? Or what should John do in that situation? So the same thing with my health being customized by my physician. We feel that the approach should be customized for the physician in this situation. So again, understanding the story, which by the attorney who reviewed my friend's contract did not. Understanding the contract, which the attorney did, he didn't explain it to my friend, and so he didn't get a good holistic way of asking a lot of questions to the employer, and understanding compensation, benefits, and then of course how to go back and how to frame those things. So having maybe a little bit of a sales background to be able to train the physician in the limited time that we would have on how they can go back to the employer and ask the questions without saying the wrong things, without putting themselves in the rough light, because sometimes it's not just the question that you ask, but it's how you ask it or who you ask it to, or do you send an email or do you call them on the phone? So I think all those things are important to discuss. And that's what I think a holistic approach means, not just having somebody redline the contract for you and then email it into the employer.
Now, I was wondering if you could tell us a success story where a physician would come to you with a standard non-negotiable contract, involve this holistic approach, and you move the needle for them. Just tell us a story that really illustrates some of the concepts that you've been talking about.
Well, we've got a lot of them. One of the stories I would say on a non-negotiable contract, I think was a good success. It was actually a situation where the physician was going to, like the situation I mentioned earlier. She was an OBGYN physician. She was taking a job in a city as her spouse was going through and finishing their fellowship training. She was going to be there for, I can't recall if it was 1 year or 2 years, but as an OBGYN physician, she was interviewing with lots of different practices. One of them was a private practice, and the contract just said about malpractice insurance, right? The employer will provide malpractice insurance. Again, it was non-negotiable contract, but it didn't say what type of insurance. It didn't say who buys tail insurance. And as you know, an OBGYN tail policy is quite expensive. And if a physician is planning on being in a situation for 1 or 2 years and then leaving, if they need to buy tail, they are going to be buying their tail insurance. So in this situation, we explained to the physician the document's unclear. And even though the document was non-negotiable, we were able to give her the tools and the resources to go back and ask the right question to the right physicians and obtain a copy of the policy, help her understand the policy. And in this situation, the non-negotiable contract wasn't necessarily changed. It was better understood. And she ended up not signing with that position. She signed with a different position where she had tail covered, even though it paid her $20,000 less, because at the end of the 1 or 2 year period, whichever it was, she and her family were going to come out ahead on finances by not buying tail insurance. So that's one of the many examples that I would have on a non-negotiable contract, if you will, and not necessarily changing it or modifying it, but having it clarified based on the perspective that we're giving the physician.
Physicians now have several options when it comes to their own contract reviews. There's national firms like yours, local attorneys as well. So
Absolutely.
what are some things that they should be asking, that they should be looking out for to find out what's the best contract review option for them?
I think making sure that they understand a lot about physician contracts, meaning they specialize in this or they do it a lot. There's not a designation on physician contracts, from any bar association. but having somebody who really understands the lingo, somebody who understands the difference between dermatology and a Mohs surgeon, or a cornea surgeon and a comprehensive ophthalmologist, or interventional cardiology and interventional radiology, and not just being able to speak the lingo, but also understanding the compensation data, and not just by saying here is some data, but being able to understand trends. I do think it's important how many reviews that firm or that person does in a year. I do think it's important that they actually speak with the physician and they get on the phone. They don't just do everything through email or through redlining contracts. And I think obviously pricing transparency is important. If I'm buying something, I don't want to be charged per hour usually, or I want to have some kind of expectation on how many hours it would be. And good turnaround times, good access to the attorney or the team of folks that's helping you with the contract. I think all those things are vital. And no conflicts of interest. In this day and age, there are companies that they want to get your data and they want to outsource you, right? So do they do the work themselves, or do they send you to third parties? Do they do the work themselves and then sell your data to other companies who might want to sell you disability insurance or physician mortgages or manage your finances with or without your permission? So if you're calling somebody for your contract review or a compensation analysis, I would hope that they would just do that and nothing else. And I think those are important considerations when any physician or nurse practitioner or anyone else is looking at choosing a firm or an individual to review their contracts.
Now, what about the differences between national versus local, where a local attorney may be more attuned to some of the politics to a specific hospital versus a national firm who may not be aware of that? So talk a little bit about the pros and cons of that contrast.
Yeah, important consideration. A local attorney is going to know more about specific changes, at that locality. They may have also conflicts of interest with the facility. We've worked in some areas where a physician says, I can't find anybody local because the hospital has a conflict with all the attorneys here. But yeah, there's definitely that dynamic of understanding the politics of an individual town and a market. States do have changing policies, regulations, laws, et cetera, and it's important that whomever's reviewing the contract keeps up on those things. And I think that's an important consideration. We would never say anybody's making a bad decision by choosing somebody locally, as long as they match all those buckets as far as making sure they have their contract reviewed by somebody who really understands physician contracts and compensation structures.
We're talking to Jonathan Appino. He's the founder of Contract Diagnostics. Contract Diagnostics is a team that offers comprehensive consulting services tailored to physicians and their families, addressing employment contracts and compensation structures. John, tell us some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
I think the one thing that I would inspire everybody to look at is, kind of, we mentioned it earlier, is not just signing your contract if you have it reviewed by whomever, but not just looking at it today and then putting it on the shelf and revisiting it never. I think it's just any different than your financial, checking in with your financial advisor, or I mentioned earlier, me going in to see my primary care physician for my annual physical. I think just like I have my health checked up, we hope to help physicians, and I think the physicians should actively seek out somebody to help them with their updates to their contract, where if they're having no raises for 3 years, for 4 years, if they're having changes to their contract, that they're not just signing something that says their RVU goes from 60 to 62, but having somebody help them through that and make sure that 62 is at value. It shouldn't be 64. And if so, how do we have that conversation? So the one thing I would leave with every physician out there is don't just sign your contract. And if it's a forever position, that's fantastic. But don't just sign it and shelf the agreement forever. Make sure you continue to do checkups every so many years on, are you paid fair market value? Are you paid what you're worth? Because just because you might be paid well doesn't mean that you're paid fairly. And that's what we do here every day, is make sure to help physicians and their families analyze and understand if that's the situation.
John, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. Thanks again for coming on the show.